Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to take a look at the Battle of Pylos in 425 BC during the Peloponnesian War. This is a kind of 3-for-1 deal. There were 3 linked battles at Pylos, all of which involved combined land-sea operations. The Peloponnesian War itself has, by this point, already been going on for 6 years. The war is essentially a competition between Athens and Sparta for dominance of the Greek world. Both city-states were major contributors to the defeat of the Persian invasion in 480 BC, the Athenians being the key driving force behind destroying Persian naval strength at the Battle of Salamis, and the Spartans bringing the Greek alliance together to defeat the Persian army at Plataea. After the Persians evacuated mainland Greece, the Greeks followed up their success by moving into the Aegean and liberating Greek city-states on the islands and the coast of Asia Minor. The Spartans disengaged from this effort, considering the job done, and the Persians repelled, returning to the Peloponnese to enjoy their position as the paramount power of Greece. The Athenians stuck with it though, and the eastern city-states rallied around them for protection. They called on Athens to lead a defensive alliance against possible Persian retaliation, founding the Delian League. From the start, the Athenians were the dominant player in the league, and what was an alliance quickly transformed into an Athenian empire. The Spartans, meanwhile, had solidified the Peloponnesian League, mostly consisting of city-states on mainland Greece, and as the Athenians started to flex their imperial muscles, the Spartans started to worry about Athenian power. So by 431 BC, the Greek world had coalesced into 2 opposing blocs, the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League, based on Spartan dominance on land and Athenian dominance at sea, respectively. In 431, a flashpoint on the island of Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, precipitates the Peloponnesian War. The classical Greek way of war revolves around hoplite warfare. A hoplite is a heavy infantryman. He's equipped with a spear and a large shield. He usually wears armour and operates as part of a phalanx. This is a tight formation, generally at least 8 ranks deep, presenting a front of overlapping shields and thrusting spear points. A typical Greek battle in the classical period involves 2 phalanxes colliding with one another and fighting until one side loses cohesion and collapses. There isn't any manoeuvring involved, there's very limited command and control because leadership involves fighting by example in the front ranks, and situational awareness inside the phalanx is in any case very quickly limited by noise, dust, and the claustrophobia. But the point of hoplite warfare is to create decisive results. Hoplites are citizen soldiers, primarily from a farming middle class. They can't afford to spend too long away from their farms. They can't afford to get engaged in long-running conflicts. So when they go to the assembly and vote to go to war, they want to produce a clear winner and a clear loser as fast as possible. So upon declaring war, the Spartans gather their allies in the Peloponnesian League and invade Attica, heading towards Athens. The aim is to precipitate either that decisive battle, which the Spartans can expect to win, or negotiations, which is what happened the last time a Spartan army turned up at the gate of Athens. But the Athenians don't come out and fight. The city was burnt to the ground by the Persians twice, and on rebuilding it, the Athenians have not only surrounded the city with walls, but they've fortified the route down to the port of Piraeus with the so-called Long Walls. Pericles, for many years the first citizen of Athens, has convinced the city-state not to fight the Spartans. The surrounding population has been evacuated into the city and the space between the long walls, where they can be safely supplied via the port thanks to Athenian naval superiority. Greek siege warfare is not only very much undeveloped. The Spartans and their allies spend years besieging nearby Plataea, which is only a fraction of the size of Athens, but even the Spartans can't afford to stay out on campaign for long periods. Spartans might famously be the professional soldiers of the Greek world, but the cost of dedicating themselves to war was dependence on subject peoples back in the Peloponnese. Spartan society is highly stratified. The Spartans themselves sit at the top of the pyramid, beneath them are allied subject peoples known as perioikoi, and at the bottom, doing all the farming and industrial work needed to sustain the whole society, are the helots, slaves from the conquered peoples of the Peloponnese. If the Spartan army spends too long away from home, there's a risk that the helots might take the opportunity to revolt. So, neither able to storm nor besiege Athens, the Spartan invasion of Attica is pretty ineffectual. The Athenians, meanwhile, exploiting their naval superiority, work to keep their empire under control and to strangle the trade routes coming to the Peloponnese from Italy. Pericles' plan is to deny the Spartans a decisive fight and keep inflicting economic damage until they negotiate a peace. Unfortunately for the Athenians, the combination of a massively increased population crammed into the streets of Athens and the influx of ships bringing supplies from all over the Mediterranean results in a plague. It's not clear exactly what disease or combination of diseases struck Athens, but anything up to a quarter of the inhabitants are killed, maybe 100,000 people. So although the Athenians have denied the Spartans their decisive battle, in the process of doing so, they've incurred horrendous losses. The Spartans, or more specifically Sparta's allies in the Peloponnesian League, are suffering from Athenian economic warfare, but that's not enough to bring them down. By 425 BC, both sides are still in the war, but they can't get to grips with one another. The Spartans keep coming back to Attica every year, but they can't defeat the Athenians on land because the Athenians refuse to come out and fight them. And although the Athenians are dominant at sea, that's not a direct threat to Sparta or her allies. The war is at a stalemate. At the beginning of summer, the Athenians set out to keep on with their peripheral strategy. Over in Sicily, the city of Messina has revolted from Athenian control with the help of the Syracusans and the Locrians. Closer to home, an Athenian-aligned faction is in control in the vital city-state of Corcyra, but they're fighting a civil war with oligarchic exiles supported by a Peloponnesian League fleet. The Athenians can't afford to either lose ground in Sicily, which is a major source of grain heading for the states of the Peloponnesian League, or allow the Corcyran fleet to fall into enemy hands and give them the numbers to challenge Athens at sea. So, having already outfitted a fleet of 40 ships in the preceding months, the Athenian assembly meets, debates, and votes for 2 of the 10 annually elected generals, Eurymedon and Sophocles, not the famous Sophocles, to take this fleet around the Peloponnese to relieve Corcyra and then cross the Adriatic to protect Athenian interests in Sicily. All Greek city-states have assemblies like this, but the Athenians are a lot more radically democratic than most other city-states. They don't have any real checks and balances in the system to stop mob rule. If you can stand up in front of the crowd and convince them to vote for your proposal, then it'll happen. Into this comes an Athenian commander called Demosthenes. Early in the war, as one of the Athenian generals, Demosthenes had taken a force of hoplites into the rough terrain of Acarnania in northwest Greece and suffered a serious defeat trying to fight against lightly armed local forces. It's not a good move to return to Athens in defeat. If the assembly decides to try you for military incompetence, you could face a fine, exile, or even execution. So Demosthenes hung around, supplemented his remaining troops with light forces from local allies, and went on to score some important victories over Peloponnesian League forces using unconventional tactics like ambushes and night attacks. This has allowed him to return to Athens in triumph and avoid getting lynched. This year, Demosthenes hasn't been elected one of the generals, but he's able to convince the Athenians to let him join the fleet. To quote Thucydides, the Athenians allowed him, at his own request, to make whatever use he liked of this fleet of theirs on its way around the Peloponnese. Demosthenes plans to put in at a place called Pylos on the western Peloponnese and construct a fortified outpost. The two generals actually in command of the fleet, Eurymedon and Sophocles, totally reject this idea. They're racing against the clock to get to Corcyra and deal with the Peloponnesian fleet. They might need all the men and ships at their disposal, and if they screw things up by helping Demosthenes out, it's entirely possible the Athenian assembly will put them on trial when they get home. Luckily for Demosthenes, a storm brews up and the fleet is forced to put into Pylos anyway. Landing on enemy territory like this is not as risky as it might seem. In fact, it's actually quite common. Greek warships in this period are triremes, which are primarily designed for ramming, so they're long, thin, and crammed with rowers to get the necessary speed up, all factors that make them completely unsuitable to stay at sea for long periods. Not only are they really unseaworthy, but there's no room to cook or sleep or anything like that. It's rare for triremes to stay at sea overnight. The standard practice is to land before nightfall and then camp out on dry land before shuffling off again in the morning. So all Athenian fleets travelling around the Peloponnese routinely land on Spartan territory. This is relatively safe. It's quite difficult for the Spartans to react fast enough to deal with them. The Athenian fleet putting in at Pylos, however, is forced to stay in the harbour by bad weather for almost a week. This is starting to get dangerous, so the soldiers and rowers take it on themselves to fortify their position, which of course is exactly what Demosthenes wanted. They don't have the proper tools for this, but Demosthenes picked Pylos because it is a tremendously strong position. It's on a short promontory protected along most of its length by a high cliff, so the Athenians don't have to do a massive amount of work to secure it, just build walls at either end between the cliff face and the sea. From this position, the Athenians have access to the fantastic harbour of what is now Navarino Bay, which is protected from the sea by the long, thin island of Sphacteria to the west, plus they're only 45 miles from Sparta itself. Demosthenes' plan is to use the base at Pylos to try and destabilise the Spartan state. The whole region is called Messenia, after the Messenians, who were one of the Peloponnesian peoples subjugated by the Spartans. Only a few decades earlier, the Messenians had staged a major revolt that the Spartans had struggled to snuff out, eventually bringing the Athenians in as mediators and arranging the removal of most of the Messenians from the Peloponnese to Naupactus on the Gulf of Corinth. Demosthenes wants to bring Messenian troops back to their ancestral lands to engage in unconventional warfare against the Spartans, to encourage the Helots, on whom Spartan society depends, to escape to Pylos or even to kick off a Helot insurgency. Eurymedon and Sophocles, meanwhile, are still not impressed, and as soon as the weather clears up, they set off again, hurrying to reach Corcyra and engage the Peloponnesian fleet. They do, however, leave Demosthenes behind with 5 ships. Each is a trireme with a crew of about 200, almost all rowers, but also some hoplites and archers serving as marines. So Demosthenes is left with a force of about 1,000 men, including, according to Thucydides, around 75 hoplites and 20 to 30 archers. The Spartans, meanwhile, take some time to react. This is partly due to believing the Athenians will quickly sail on, partly due to there being a religious festival at Sparta, something the very conservative Spartans take seriously, but mainly because the army is away ravaging Attica in the annual invasion. This year, it isn't going well. They set off a bit earlier than usual before the crops have ripened, so there's not as much food to forage and pillage, the weather is pretty miserable, and yet again the Athenians don't come out to play. So when King Agis, leading the invasion, hears of the Athenians setting up a base on Spartan soil at Pylos, he doesn't need a lot of convincing to cut the invasion short and return home. On getting back to Sparta, he mobilises the local Spartan forces and their perioikoi auxiliaries, sending them straight to Pylos. The rest of the army follows on at a slower pace, having just come back from campaign. The Spartans also recall their fleet from Corcyra. This is the fleet that the Athenians had initially sailed to deal with, and their way back south is contested by Eurymedon and Sophocles, now at the island of Zakynthos. The Spartans managed to sneak past the Athenian scout screen by taking a shortcut over the isthmus at Leucas, dragging their ships over land, and head for Pylos. Demosthenes has gotten wind of this. A few Messenian ships have already reached him, bringing a few more men and some equipment, as well as news. He immediately sends off 2 of his 5 ships to recall the Athenian fleet, and then prepares to repel the impending Spartan assault. There are only 3 places the Spartans can attack Demosthenes' position at Pylos. From land, they can attack the choke points north and south of the cliffs, where the Athenians have built walls, but they can also attempt to land troops on the rocky beaches behind the position and attack them in the rear. This is the weakest section of the Athenian defence. It's not only much more lightly fortified, but there's more ground to cover, so the defenders will be stretched thinner. The Athenians, used to operating with naval superiority, were simply not really expecting to have to defend against a naval landing. So Demosthenes leaves most of his men to defend the landward fortifications and takes 60 hoplites and a few archers down to the rocky shoreline to hold the beach. It might be the weakest section of the defence, but it's also the hardest section for the Spartans to attack. The rocks make landing very difficult and risky. Triremes will have to back in because their rams stop them getting close enough to disembark from the front, and then, once in position, the high rears of the triremes prevent the troops on board from surging ashore. They can't exactly jump off onto the rocks in their armour, they have to go down gangplanks. And Demosthenes realises this. He says to his men, they will be easiest to repel while they are still on board their ships, since, once they're on land, they will already be on even terms with us. As for their numbers, there is no need to be too frightened. However many of them there are, they can only engage with small detachments at a time, because of their inability to bring ships in close to the shore. I consider the enemy's difficulties make up for our lack of numbers, and at the same time I call upon you as Athenians, who know from experience all about landing ships on foreign shores and how impossible it is to force a landing if the defenders stand firm. The Spartans start their attack. Thucydides never even mentions the battle on the landward side. Evidently, the Spartans were never able to seriously threaten to storm the Athenian fortifications. Not exactly surprising given the terrain. Round on the beach, though, it's a different story. The Spartans have 43 ships with them, but there's only enough room to land a few at a time amongst the rocks, so they start up a relay to maintain constant pressure. It's made all the more difficult by the trireme captains being very wary about damaging their vessels, and the fact that the awkward landing makes it easy for the Athenians to concentrate exactly where the Spartans are coming ashore. One of the Spartan officers, a man named Brasidas, who will go on to be an influential figure in the later part of the first half of the war, is exhorting his men to throw themselves into the attack regardless of the risk to their ships. He knows as much as any of the Spartans that they have a short window to attack Pylos from the sea before an Athenian fleet returns. So Brasidas leads by example, trying to storm ashore, but accumulates so many wounds in the process that he faints. Demosthenes is absolutely right about the defensive situation on the shoreline. If we think about this in terms of force-to-space ratios, the Spartans coming down the gangplanks can only attack 1 man at a time, while the Athenians can stack 3 or 4 men at the bottom. The Spartans have the numbers to keep the attack up all day, and then come back and attack until halfway into the next, but the Athenians never lose control of the beach. Realizing they're not getting anywhere, the Spartans disengage and settle in for a formal siege, sending off men to gather wood so they can start building siege equipment. Then, the Athenian fleet reappears, reinforced by other Athenian naval forces they've contacted in northwest Greece, and numbering about 50 ships. The Spartans are all over the harbour, and there's not enough room inside Demosthenes' defensive perimeter to land and stay, A good place to land might have been the island of Sphacteria, but the Spartans have anticipated this and already put a force ashore to deny it to the Athenians. So the fleet retires to the nearby uninhabited island of Prote to spend the night. They come back in the morning ready to fight a naval battle and find, to their surprise, that the Spartans haven't prepared for the showdown. There are only 2 entrances into the harbour on either side of the island, and the sensible course of action for the Spartans would have been to block these off with their ships and force the Athenians to attack them head on. For some reason though, the Spartans haven't done this, and the Athenians are able to punch into the harbour itself and fall on a hastily forming Spartan battle line. They absolutely smash this, taking 5 ships in the process and chasing the survivors back to the Spartan camp on the shore, where the rest of the Spartan triremes are pulled up on the beach. A fight quickly develops over these Spartan ships. Some of them are trying to put to sea, and the Athenians ram or board them. Others are unmanned, and the Athenians jump across to tie tow cables so they can drag them off and capture them. The Spartans are horrified by all of this. Athenian naval victory in the harbour would trap their men over on Sphacteria. So the Spartans do their best to fight the Athenians off their ships, holding onto the bows while the Athenians try to tow them away by the sterns, climbing up onto the decks and trying to force Athenian marines and sailors off their ships. The battle rages for hours, but ultimately the Spartans are able to retain all their vessels, except the ones taken by the Athenians in the initial fight in the bay. Nonetheless, it's a significant Athenian victory, and they declare it as such by the proper procedure. They gather up weapons and armour from dead Spartans and use them to set up a trophy on the tiny island of Chelonisi in the middle of the bay, which naturally the Spartans can't actually get to contest now, and then they return the Spartan dead for proper burial. Then they start patrolling around Sphacteria to make sure the Spartan force trapped there can't escape. This is a huge, apparently unexpected problem for the Spartans. They have about 440 men on the island, probably a mix of Spartans and perioikoi, supported by an unknown number of Helot attendants. The Spartans might be the ultra-conservatives of the Greek world, but they still have voting assemblies, and those Spartans on the island are still voting citizens. At least 100 are from the Spartan officer class, representing important families. So there is immediate internal political pressure to get them back, compounded by external political pressure. The Spartans have purposefully cultivated an image of being the best soldiers in Greece that persists down to the modern day. Spartans come home with their shields or upon them, they fight to the last man against any odds, and they use this image to help maintain their position as Greece's preeminent land power. A lot of people would rather negotiate than face the Spartan phalanx in battle. Exposing over 400 men to the threat of defeat in detail by superior Athenian forces, or worse, to the embarrassment of a slow death by isolation, is not something the Spartan state can tolerate. They immediately send out government officials from Sparta to get to grips with the situation and decide what to do. And what they ultimately decide on is an armistice. They meet with the Athenian generals and hammer out terms for a pause in hostilities. The Spartans agree to deliver to the Athenians at Pylos all of their ships. They agree not to make further assaults on Pylos, that the men on the island will be supplied with agreed upon rations under Athenian supervision, that no Spartans will visit the men on the island except with the express permission of the Athenians, that the Athenians themselves will also refrain from attacking and, at the conclusion of the armistice, will return the Spartan ships. They also agree to send a Spartan delegation to Athens, carried in Athenian ships, and that the armistice will remain in force until this delegation returns, there is some kind of settlement, or if either side infringes on the terms. This might seem like a massive series of concessions on behalf of the Spartans and that the Athenians hold all the cards, but it's not that simple. The Athenians are actually in a fairly tough position themselves. They have to maintain as constant a naval presence around the island as they can, but at the same time they have to base their fleet about 10 kilometers away at Prote. They can't operate out of the bay at Pylos because of the Spartan presence on land. There's only a limited accessible water supply in the immediate area, and that's a spring inside Demosthenes' fort where it's impossible to land a lot of ships at once. Even at Prote, there are no naval facilities to maintain the fleet's triremes. If these spend months at sea, they're going to seriously degrade. Beyond the immediate problems, once the weather closes in the autumn, it's going to be very difficult for the Athenians to maintain a blockade of the island. Naval operations in this period generally stop over the winter months, simply because triremes are so unseaworthy. Looking at it from that perspective, the Spartans are playing for time. If they can string things along until later in the year, the Athenians will have to disengage, and they can evacuate their men without suffering some kind of disaster. That is a backup option though. When the Spartan delegation arrives in Athens, they go in front of the assembly and propose peace. They pitch a reasonable settlement as an opportunity for the Athenians to capitalize on their good fortune at Pylos, warning them not only that the Peloponnesian League has the means to keep fighting, but that they should really end the war before either side does something that raises the stakes and makes future negotiations much more difficult. They round out their speech by offering an alliance as well. This is pretty typical of classical Greek peace negotiations, pointing out that this would allow Athens and Sparta to cement their unassailable positions as the dominant states of Greece. The Spartans appear to have thought that by this point in the war, the Athenians had suffered enough without any real gains, and they're ready to accept peace, and that what had been preventing them from coming to terms had been Sparta's reluctance to engage with them diplomatically. They are totally wrong about this. The Athenians understand the stakes down at Pylos and realise that as long as they have the men on the island trapped, they have leverage over Sparta that they can use to get better terms. To make matters worse, the Spartan delegation's speech was really pretty patronising, essentially suggesting that the Athenians got lucky and that wouldn't happen again. Cleon, who is one of the Athenian demagogues able to really whip up the crowd, successfully argues to the assembly that the men on Sphacteria should be brought to Athens as hostages against future Spartan invasions of Attica, and that Sparta should not only give up territory in the Athenian Empire that it's gained so far, but more besides. This is unacceptable to the Spartans, but they suggest if they could discuss all the points separately in private, in some kind of committee rather than in front of the assembly, then they could perhaps hammer out some kind of agreement in a calmer, less highly charged atmosphere. This allows Cleon to accuse them of being dishonest, saying that if they were really sincere about negotiating, then they should have no problems doing it out in public instead of behind closed doors. There's no way the Spartans are going to do that, and it's obvious that they're not going to get anywhere, so the delegation leaves with nothing and travels back to Pylos. The return of the delegation means that the armistice is over. The Athenians immediately claim that the Spartans violated the terms and refused to hand their ships back. Both sides now settle into a kind of distant siege of the island. The Spartans keep trying to smuggle food in using small boats and divers. The Athenians maintain their blockade as best they can. But conditions haven't really changed, except for the fact that the trip the Spartan delegation took to Athens burnt some time, about 20 days. The Spartans on the island still need to hang on with limited supplies, and the Athenians, although now reinforced to a strength of about 70 ships, still need to hang on in the area with all their difficulties of supply and maintenance far from home. Back in Athens itself, with no conclusion in sight as the weeks drag on, and the concern that the approaching autumn weather will force them to lift the blockade, the citizenry are now regretting their refusal of Spartan peace terms. Cleon, who was the driving force behind this rejection, realises he's getting unpopular and attempts to deflect blame onto the generals by accusing them of being too scared to storm the island. He directs most of his accusations at the general Nicias, who is very aristocratic and very cautious, who replies with words to the effect, "If it's so easy, why don't you have a go?" Cleon assumes this is a rhetorical flourish by Nicias and plays along until Nicias stands down in front of the assembly and offers his command. Realizing that the general isn't bluffing, Cleon furiously tries to backpedal his way out, but by now the crowd is at his throat, the way crowds are when they smell blood, and he's forced to accept. He sets sail for Pylos, boasting that he'll get the job done in 20 days without taking any more Athenian troops with him. His political opponents wave goodbye, feeling pretty pleased with themselves. Either he'll fail, in which case he's finished politically, or he'll somehow succeed, and Athens will have won a significant victory. Luckily for Cleon, Demosthenes again has a plan. The Athenians have been reluctant to make a landing because the island of Sphacteria is covered in woods and undergrowth that conceal the strength and dispositions of the Spartans trapped there. Especially after his earlier disasters in the rough wooded terrain of northwest Greece, the last thing Demosthenes wants to do is plunge into the unknown, where a smaller force that knows the ground has a significant advantage. Although the Athenians aren't prepared to commit to a landing in force, triremes do occasionally land on the island. There isn't enough space at Pylos for all the ships on patrol to come ashore for their meals. It's just impractical to feed a 200-man trireme crew while they're afloat, so sometimes ships will beach themselves on Sphacteria to cook and eat. During one of these landings, a fire starts. Thucydides paints this as an accident by a careless sailor. It's not impossible that Demosthenes ordered it. Either way, the vegetation on the island has been drying out in the Greek sun over the summer, and the fire burns most of it off, revealing the size and deployment of the Spartan force. There are more than Demosthenes was expecting, but they're split into 3 components. In the centre of the island is the main camp, with the bulk of the Spartan force around the only spring. To the north, a smaller force has occupied and reinforced an old fort on the high ground overlooking the strait between Sphacteria and Pylos. Then in the south, there's a small outpost manned by only 30 or so hoplites. Demosthenes takes all this in and immediately starts planning, sharing his plan with Cleon when he arrives. Cleon is obviously keen to get a move on, and probably pretty relieved that Demosthenes has something up his sleeve. Together, they meet with the Spartans on the mainland, and again call on them to convince their comrades on the island to surrender. The Spartans naturally refuse, so the Athenians resolve to make their attack. Demosthenes loads his troops up in darkness and sets out, mimicking the usual early morning Athenian routine, and lands his first detachment on the south of the island before dawn. They overrun the Spartan outpost, catching them unawares. Most of the Spartans die in their beds or before they can grab their weapons. At dawn, with the benefit of the light, the rest of the Athenians land. All in all, Thucydides remarks that Demosthenes has 800 hoplites, 800 archers, and 800 peltasts, who are light troops usually armed with javelins or slings, plus contingents of rowers from the fleet acting as siloi. Siloi are basically poorly equipped peltasts. They don't usually have shields or armour, they're very lightly armed with missile weapons. But Demosthenes has 70 ships at his disposal, and with 180 potential siloi from each ship, he has at least several thousand of them at his disposal. He splits his force into groups of about 200 and starts spreading them out over the island, seizing all the high ground they can and trying to surround the Spartan camp in the centre. The Spartan leader on the island, Epitadas, falls his men in and moves to attack the Athenian hoplites, looking for that decisive hoplite battle. That's what the Spartans are trained and equipped for, and even though they're seriously outnumbered, they're probably down to about 400 men, they have the reputation of Spartan martial prowess backing them up. Epitadas may have thought that if he could smash the Athenian hoplites, the rest of Demosthenes' force would lose heart, scatter, and flee back to the ships. The Athenian hoplites are drawn up together on some high ground, holding steady, but the Spartans never reach them. As they plough forward, they find themselves being showered from the sides with arrows, javelins, and stones from the mass of Athenian light troops. The Spartans aren't able to effectively deal with this. They're encumbered by their shields and armour, and trying to chase down their more lightly equipped antagonists would inevitably see them disperse, leaving them vulnerable not just to a sudden movement by the Athenian hoplites, but to the hit-and-run missile tactics of the archers Peltas and Psiloi coming at them from all sides. Although they might have scored some successes against Athenian troops who strayed too close and were exposed to sudden dashes and stabbing spears, the Spartans don't really have any other choice but to take the punishment. Casualties are probably pretty low at this stage, they're well protected behind their shields, but as time goes on and the Spartans become more tired and more sluggish, fighting in the sun, the Athenians grow in confidence. Thucydides relates how they had been nervous to confront the Spartans at first because of their famous reputation, but now after a few hours of fighting them, they've become emboldened and disdainful. The light troops start charging in to pelt the Spartans before falling back, churning up the ash from the fire into great clouds that reduce visibility, all the time shouting en masse and drowning out the Spartans' orders. Soon, the Spartans start to lose their situational awareness. They're nearly blind and deaf, and obviously not in a good position. So they make the call to start falling back on the fort at the north end of the island. Now they start taking more losses. A fighting retreat is always difficult. The Spartans are massively outnumbered. They have command and control problems, and they have a good 1,500 meters to go. They manage it, though, and inside the fort they've gained a much stronger position. This probably doesn't have significant fortifications, but its location on the high ground up against the cliffs prevents the Athenians from surrounding them completely and forces them into a head-on fight. This is much more in line with how the Spartans want to fight, and when the Athenian hoplites finally come forward to attempt a storm, they're able to hold them at bay. The battle continues, but the Athenians are now not getting anywhere. The Spartan position is not good in the long term, there's no water supply up in the fort, but neither Demosthenes nor Cleon are inclined to wait them out. So when one of the commanders of the light troops, a Messenian who may well have had local knowledge, suggests that he might be able to take a force around the back of the Spartan position, scale the cliff, and attack them from behind, they agree. It's not entirely clear what route this force took, but the cliff is apparently a lot less unassailable than it looks from the top. All of a sudden, the Spartans start getting showered with missiles from behind, and they realise that, somehow, the Athenians have gotten round behind them. Caught by surprise, and with continued pressure from the Athenian hoplites to their front, the Spartans realise they can't hold on anymore and try to disengage, falling back further into the fort and probably trying to gird themselves for a last stand. Cleon and Demosthenes want them alive if possible, though. Cleon in particular wants to take them back to Athens as hostages, so they pull their own forces back and ask the Spartans to surrender. Most of the survivors appear to be up for this. They're exhausted, isolated, and probably understand that they're not going to get some kind of glorious, heroic death. The Athenians will just mow them down with arrows and javelins. The Spartan commander is now Styphon. He's the third in command. The original commander Epitadas is dead. The 2 IC is so seriously wounded he's assumed to be dead. Styphon asks if he can send a man to the mainland to seek advice. The Athenians refuse, but they do allow Spartan heralds to travel to the island to consult. After judging the situation, the heralds inform Styphon that the Spartans order you to make your own decision about yourselves, so long as you do nothing dishonourable. After they've left, the 292 surviving Spartan hoplites talk amongst themselves, and then surrender. The Athenians have won 3 battles in a row at Pylos. They leave a garrison and sail back to Athens with their prisoners, while the Spartan army returns home in dismay. The surrender sends shockwaves through the Greek world. Spartans aren't supposed to surrender, they're supposed to fight to the death. This is a serious loss of face for the Spartan state, a diminishing of their image, but it doesn't appear to have had any significant practical effects. They certainly took a blow to their confidence, not helped by the Athenians garrisoning Pylos with Messenians, who go on to conduct a kind of guerrilla war in their own homeland, or by the Athenian establishment of similar bases around the edge of the Peloponnese. But it doesn't end the war. Spartan society is certainly undermined by unconventional warfare efforts stirring up the helots on which they depend, but not to an unmanageable extent. In a similar vein, the Athenians might have scored a significant victory, but they had turned down an opportunity to end the war, at least for now, and now they had to sustain the cost of maintaining significant forces in this new string of outposts. They might have taken almost 300 prisoners and used them to deter future Spartan invasions of Attica by threatening to execute them if the Spartans show up, but although the invasions created immense financial difficulties for Attic farmers, they didn't threaten the Athenian Empire. In fact, the success of Pylos and the reluctance of the Spartans to risk the death of the prisoners provoked them to look for other ways to strike at Athens, eventually conducting their own less than conventional campaign against the Athenian subject states of the Chalcidice. In other words, the competing power blocks of the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League were not vulnerable to small peripheral vassals. Even as great a disaster as the later Athenian expedition to Sicily that resulted in the loss of more than 10,000 hoplites and 200 ships was not enough to bring down the Athenian Empire. They carried on after that for almost another decade. That's a completely different story though. The base of this video has been Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. This is a fantastic piece of work. I can't recommend it enough. It's a staple of military history and international relations courses around the world for good reason and well worth a read. Hope you all enjoyed this one. A bit longer than I was expecting, but it's such an interesting battle. I'll catch you in the next video.